Your beast growls every time I touch her, the Luna said. Her voice was like ice shards scraping against stone, a sound designed to make lesser wolves flinch. He has not made a sound for you in 10 years, Kaelin, yet for this kitchen maid, he threatens your chosen. The Alpha King said nothing. Ilara knelt on the cold flagstones of the throne room, her head bowed so low her forehead nearly touched the floor. She did not dare to breathe. The scent of sea salt and winter clung to the Luna's velvet robes, a perfume that couldn't quite mask the acidic edge of her fury. The king's scent was different. It was the deep, clean smell of a storm gathering far out over the ocean, of ancient stone and colder, deeper ice. It was a scent that had haunted her dreams for weeks. Silence stretched, thick and heavy as a shroud. In that silence, Ilara could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her own small, trembling form. She was nothing, a scullery maid, an orphan with calloused hands and a perpetually empty stomach. To be the subject of a confrontation between the Alpha King and his Luna was a death sentence. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the command that would end her. But it was not a command that came. It was a sound. A low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the very floor beneath her knees. It was not from the king's throat. It was deeper, more primal. It was the sound of the beast inside him, the ancient wolf that was the source of all his power. And it was aimed, unmistakably, at the Luna. A collective gasp went through the assembled court. The king's silence held for another heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of anger, yet it cracked through the tension like a whip. "Get out." The words were not for her. "Kaelin," the Luna began, her voice tight with disbelief. "Now, Seraphina." The rustle of velvet was the only answer. The scent of her fury receded, leaving only the cold, vast emptiness of the king's presence. Ilara remained frozen, a statue of terror. She waited. For what? She did not know. The end of her life, most likely. "Look at me," the king commanded. His voice was softer now, meant only for her. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Slowly, trembling, she lifted her head. She had only ever seen him from a distance before, a towering figure of granite and sorrow, his silver-shot black hair framing a face that was brutally handsome and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes, the color of a winter sea, were legendary for their coldness. But the eyes that met hers now were not cold. They were burning. A storm of something she could not name churned in their depths. He saw her, not as a servant, not as an object of dispute, but as her, Ilara. And in that moment, the throne room, the court, the entire world fell away, and a single, terrifying question echoed in the ruins of her mind. How had it come to this? 3 months earlier, her world had been defined by the color gray. The gray stone of the castle, the gray sea that crashed against the cliffs below, the gray, greasy water in her scrubbing bucket. Ilara's life was a cycle of aching bones and the gnawing ache of hunger. She was a ghost in the machine of the royal household, a pair of hands to scour pots and mend linens, easily overlooked and more easily replaced. Her only rebellion, her only splash of color, was a secret. On a forgotten turret, exposed to the biting sea wind, she kept a small garden. It was a collection of wooden crates filled with soil she'd stolen from the kitchens, spoonful by spoonful. Nothing should have grown there. The salt spray should have killed everything. But for her, things grew. Stubborn, hardy herbs. A single defiant rosebush that produced pale, silver-white blooms with a scent of cinnamon and snow. She didn't know why. It was a small magic she never questioned, a private miracle in a life devoid of them. She would press her fingers into the cool, damp earth and feel a quiet hum, a sense of rightness that she felt nowhere else in the vast, cold castle. The castle was a reflection of its king. King Kaelin was a man carved from the cliffside itself. He had ruled for a century, ever since the tragedy that had claimed his parents and his younger sister. A tragedy no one spoke of. He had secured their borders, filled their coffers, and frozen his own heart. He moved through the halls with a chilling, remote grace, his face a mask of indifference. He had taken a Luna, Serafina, from a powerful neighboring pack 10 years ago, a political alliance that had produced no heirs and no warmth. Ilara knew to make herself small when he passed, to press herself into the wall and stare at the floor, to cease to exist until his vast, lonely presence had moved on. That all changed on the day of the trade delegation from the Sunstone Peaks. The Great Hall was a riot of noise and color, a stark contrast to the usual muted tones of the court. The delegates were loud, dressed in garish yellows and oranges, their voices grating. Their leader, Lord Valerius, was a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He was presenting a gift to the king, a display of fealty. But the real show was one of power. At his feet, cowering, was a young wolf pup from the king's own pack. It couldn't have been more than 6 months old, its silver fur matted with dirt. It had apparently been caught straying near their caravan. "A demonstration of our loyalty, Your Majesty," Valerius purred, his boot resting near the pup's head. "We return what is yours." King Kalen sat on his throne of driftwood and black stone, his expression unreadable. He simply inclined his head. Valerius, emboldened by the king's passivity, decided to press his advantage. He wanted to show everyone that he could abuse something belonging to the great Alpha King and suffer no consequences. He nudged the pup with his toe. "A bit scrawny, isn't it? Our mountain wolves have more spirit." The pup let out a tiny, frightened whimper. Valerius laughed and kicked it. It wasn't a hard kick, more of a contemptuous shove, but the pup yelped, a sound of pure pain and terror that sliced through the noise of the hall. Silence fell. Every wolf in the room, from the lowest guard to the highest noble, tensed. An insult to the pack was an insult to the Alpha. They looked to their king, expecting thunder and lightning. King Kalen did not move. His face remained a mask of stone. His beast was silent. He seemed hollow. Ilara was standing near the kitchens, a tray of goblets in her hands, her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the pup try to crawl away, its leg dragging. She saw Valerius raise his boot for another kick, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. And something inside her broke. The years of being small, of being silent, of being nothing. They all shattered. She didn't think. She acted. The tray crashed to the floor. Goblets shattered, wine spreading like blood across the stone. Before anyone could react, Ilara had darted across the floor and thrown her own thin body over the pup, shielding it from the blow. "Stop," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear in the dead silence. "Please, he's just a child." The world held its breath. Lord Valerius stared down at her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. A servant, a nobody. She had publicly defied him. He turned his furious gaze to the throne. "Your Majesty, this filth dares to interrupt." He never finished the sentence. King Kalen had risen from his throne. He didn't stride. He flowed, a predator moving with lethal, unhurried grace. He did not look at Valerius. He did not look at the court. His winter-sea eyes were fixed entirely on Ilara. He saw the shivering pup beneath her, already licking her hand. He saw the defiant terror in her eyes. He saw the way she protected the weakest thing in the room without a thought for her own safety. And for the first time in 50 years, the beast inside Kalen stirred from its guilt-ridden slumber. It did not roar. It simply woke up. And it recognized something. Mine. The word was not spoken. It was a feeling, a pressure in the air. A sudden crushing sense of possession that made every wolf in the hall lower their eyes in submission. Kalen stopped a few feet from her. He looked at Lord Valerius, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was pure, distilled contempt. "The trade negotiations are concluded," he said, his voice soft as falling snow but heavy as an avalanche. Leave my lands before sundown. If you are still here when the moon rises, my wolves will hunt you for sport." Valerius paled, stammered, and practically fled the hall, his delegation scrambling after him. The king's gaze returned to Ilara. She was still on the floor, her arms wrapped around the whimpering pup. She was shaking so hard she thought her bones might come apart. He knelt. The Alpha King, who had never lowered himself for anyone, knelt on the wine-stained floor in front of a scullery maid. He reached out a hand, not to her, but to the pup. The small creature, which had been terrified moments before, crawled out from her arms and began to lick the king's fingers, its tail giving a weak thump, thump, thump against the stone. "What is your name?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ilara, Your Majesty." It was a thread of a sound. "You are no longer a kitchen servant, Ilara." He rose to his full, intimidating height. "You will be housed in the royal wing. You will be the sole caretaker of this pup. He will answer to you, and you will answer only to me." He glanced at his captain of the guard. "See to it." Without another word, he turned and swept from the hall, leaving behind a stunned court, a fuming Luna, and a young woman whose entire world had just been broken apart and remade in the space of a single heartbeat. The royal wing was a world of silence and shadows. Ilara's new room was larger than the entire dormitory she had shared with 10 other servants. It had a real bed with velvet hangings, a window that looked out over the crashing sea, and a hearth that was always lit. It was a gilded cage, and she was terrified. The pup, whom she named Cinder, was her only companion. He was a small, warm bundle of life in the cold expanse of her new reality. Her duties were simple: care for him, feed him, walk him, play with him. It was a ridiculous, unheard-of position. Her room adjoined the king's private study. She never saw him enter or leave, but she knew he was there. Sometimes, late at night, she could hear the restless pacing of his feet on the floor, a heavy, rhythmic tread like a caged panther. He had a rule, a boundary she learned without it ever being spoken. He would not interact with her. He had given her a new station, a new life, but he himself remained remote, a distant, brooding presence on the other side of a wall. He believed he was tainted. She learned this in whispers from the other staff, who now treated her with a mixture of fear and awe. They spoke of the fire night 50 years ago, when the old king and queen and their daughter, Princess Lyra, had been burned alive in a raid by mountain clans. Kaelin, then a young alpha, had been leading a patrol on the border. He had arrived too late. He had saved his kingdom, but he had not saved his family. The guilt had hollowed him out. He had ruled with perfect cold efficiency ever since, denying himself any joy, any warmth. He performed his duties, including taking a political Luna, but his heart, they said, had turned to ash that night. He would not have a true mate. He did not believe he deserved one. Ilara understood his wall. She had walls of her own, but his boundary began to erode in small, almost imperceptible ways. It started with the pup. Cinder would often scratch at the door to the king's study. The first time it happened, Ilara had been frantic, trying to pull the pup away. But the door had opened. King Kaelin stood there, looking down at the pup, his face an impassive mask. Then his eyes lifted to hers. A flicker of something. Surprise? Annoyance? Crossed his features before being suppressed. "He is restless?" Kaelin stated. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty, I will take him out." "The North Gardens are private," he said, then closed the door. It was a suggestion, but it felt like a gift. The North Gardens were for the royal family only. They were sheltered from the wind, and things grew there. She took Cinder, and as she walked among the ancient sea-stunted trees, she felt the king's eyes on her from a high window. She didn't look up, but the weight of his gaze was a physical touch on her skin. Then came the books. A small stack of them appeared outside her door one morning. Old histories of the kingdom, treatises on herb lore, collections of poetry. There was no note. There was no explanation. but she knew they were from him. She would read them late into the night, the words a lifeline in her lonely silence. The greatest shift came with her flowers. Missing her turret garden, she had found a small, cracked stone pot and filled it with soil from the north garden. In it, she planted a cutting from her silver rose. She kept it on her windowsill. One morning, she woke to find a single perfect bloom had opened. Its scent filled the room. On an impulse, she plucked it, and, when she knew the king was out of his study, she slipped inside. The room was Spartan, dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. It smelled of him, that scent of storm and stone. With trembling fingers, she placed the single silver rose in an empty inkwell on his desk. She fled back to her room, her heart pounding, certain she had crossed a line. That evening, she heard him enter the study. The silence stretched. She waited for a furious summons, for the guards to come and drag her to the dungeons. Instead, she heard only the sound of a chair scraping back, and then, a long, deep sigh. It was a sound of such profound weariness, such ancient sorrow, that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. He kept the rose. She began leaving one for him every morning. He never mentioned them, but she knew he saw them. Sometimes, when she entered his study to retrieve the old pot, she would find a book left open on his desk, a passage about the stars or an old legend underlined. It was a silent conversation, a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of their stations. His beast was not silent. Whenever she was near, she could feel the low thrum of its contentment. It was like the purr of a great cat, a vibration in the very air around him. And when others approached her, it changed. The Luna, Seraphina, had tried to assert her dominance early on. She had cornered Ilara in a hallway, her beautiful face twisted with contempt. "You are a pet," Seraphina had hissed, reaching out to grab Ilara's arm. "A stray the king took pity on. Do not forget your place." Before her fingers could make contact, a growl echoed down the hall. It was not loud, but it was filled with such lethal promise that Seraphina froze, her hand hovering in the air. King Kalen stood at the far end of the corridor, his eyes fixed on them. He said nothing, but his beast spoke for him. Seraphina had snatched her hand back as if burned. The jealousy had festered, growing into a poisonous hatred that Ilara could feel like a physical chill whenever the Luna was near. Seraphina saw the eroding of the king's boundaries. She saw the way his eyes would follow Ilara when he thought no one was looking. She saw the single silver rose that was always on his desk. She saw her own position, her own power, slipping away. The tension in the castle grew thick and suffocating. It all came to a head on a cold, windswept afternoon. Seraphina requested an audience with the king in the throne room, insisting Ilara be present as a witness to some supposed transgression. Ilara knelt on the floor, her heart a cold stone in her chest, as Seraphina laid out her grievances. She spoke of disrespect, of a servant getting above her station, of the dangerous precedent the king was setting. It was a carefully crafted speech, designed to corner him, to force him to choose his political Luna over the orphan girl. She saved her final, most potent weapon for last. "Your beast growls every time I touch her," Seraphina said, her voice ringing with accusation. "He has not made a sound for you in 10 years, Kalen, yet for this kitchen maid, he threatens your chosen." The words hung in the air, a declaration of war. And that was when the beast had answered, its growl shaking the very foundations of the throne. That was when the king had banished his Luna from his sight. "Look at me," he commanded. She did. She met his burning gaze, and the past 3 months crashed into the present. She saw everything that had passed between them in silence. The pup, the gardens, the books, the flowers. A connection forged in whispers and small gestures, now laid bare before the entire court. He held out a hand to her. "Ilara, come here." Her body moved without her permission. She placed her trembling hand in his. His skin was not cold, as she had imagined. It was warm, his calloused fingers closing around hers with a possessive strength that sent a shock straight to her soul. He pulled her to her feet, drawing her to his side. He turned to face the stunned court, his arm a solid, unyielding bar behind her back. He was claiming her, in front of everyone. "This is my will," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent for decades. "She is under my personal protection. Any who question it will answer to me." His gaze swept the room, and even the most hardened warriors flinched from the raw power in his eyes. For the first time since the fire night, the king was not just ruling, he was alive. But as he led her from the throne room, away from the whispers and the shocked stares, Alara caught a glimpse of Seraphina's face. The Luna's expression was not one of mere anger or humiliation. It was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. It was a promise of ruin. And Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a war she had no idea how to fight. The days that followed were a blur of surreal calm before an inevitable storm. Kalen moved her into the suite of chambers opposite his own, a place that had been empty since his mother's death. The court treated her with a terrified deference. They called her the Lady Alara, but the name felt like a costume she was wearing. Kalen spoke to her now, not often, and not about anything of substance, but the silence between them was different. It was no longer a wall, but a shared space. He would ask about Cinder. He would comment on a book she was reading. One evening, he found her in the north garden, her hands buried in the earth of a flower bed she was tending. He simply stood and watched her for a long time, a strange, hungry look in his eyes. "Things grow for you," he said, his voice quiet. "Even here, in this salt-scoured land. They just need a reason to," she had replied without thinking. His expression had shuddered, the sorrow returning to his eyes. "I buried all my reasons long ago." He had turned and walked away before she could say more. Seraphina was gone. The king had officially set her aside, citing her disrespect. She had been sent back to her own lands in disgrace, but her presence lingered like a poison in the air. Her loyalists in the court watched Alara with cold eyes. Whispers followed her like shadows, dark and ugly. They called her a witch, a seductress who had enchanted the king. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and brutal. It began with the king falling ill, a sudden, violent sickness that left him pale and weak. The healers were baffled. It was not a poison they could identify. It seemed to sap his very life force, leaving him listless, trapped in a haze of fever and nightmares. Alara refused to leave his side. She bathed his brow with cool water. She spoke to him softly. She held his hand when the tremors took him. In his delirium, he would murmur names: Lyra, father, mother. He was reliving the fire night, trapped in the inferno of his guilt. Then the accusations started. A captain of the guard loyal to Seraphina produced a vial. It had been found, he claimed, hidden in Alara's room. It contained a rare, slow-acting poison derived from a mountain flower that grew only in the Sunstone Peaks, Seraphina's former home. The story was perfect. The spurned kitchen maid, elevated beyond her station, had been a plant all along. An assassin sent by Lord Valerius and Seraphina to finish the job the fire had started 50 years ago. She had seduced the king, gained his trust, and then struck. It was a lie, but it was a lie that made sense to a court already primed to distrust her. It played on their fears, their prejudices, and most of all, it played on the king's oldest, deepest wound. The council convened. With the king incapacitated, his treacherous cousin Lord Morcant took charge. Morcant had always been allied with Seraphina. He pronounced Alara guilty of treason and witchcraft. The sentence was death. She was to be thrown from the highest tower, the sea dragon's tooth, at the next high tide. They dragged her from the king's bedside. His eyes were glassy with fever, but as they pulled her away, he seemed to focus on her for a moment. Her name was a broken whisper on his lips. Ilara. They locked her in a cold, damp cell. For 2 days she waited for the end, her heart a block of ice. She didn't fear death for herself, She feared what would happen to Kaelin. Without her, she knew the poison would finish its work. Seraphina would not just kill her, she would destroy the man who had rejected her. On the third day, the guards came for her. They dragged her up the winding stairs of the sea dragon's tooth. The wind howled around the tower, a mournful cry. Far below, the sea churned gray and furious, crashing against the rocks. Morkant was there, along with a handful of his men. His face was triumphant. "The king you bewitched cannot save you now," he sneered. "Your magic dies with you." They forced her toward the edge, toward the crumbling parapet that overlooked the abyss. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "Kaelin, get away from her." The voice was not the king's. It was raw, ragged, and filled with a power that made the very stones of the tower vibrate. Ilara's eyes flew open. Kaelin stood at the top of the stairs. He was not the sick man she had left behind. He was leaning heavily on the wall for support, his face pale as bone, sweat beading on his brow. But his eyes were blazing with pure, unrestrained fury. The beast was looking through them, and it was a terrifying sight. "Majesty," Morkant stammered, his bravado vanishing. "She is a traitor, a witch." "She is my mate," Kaelin growled, the words resonating with the Alpha's command, "and you have laid hands on what is mine." He pushed himself off the wall and launched himself forward. He was weak, his movements clumsy, but he was driven by a desperation that transcended physical limits. He fought like a cornered wolf, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. He was saving her. He had dragged himself from his deathbed to save her, but he was too weak. He took down 2 of Morkant's men before a third plunged a dagger into his side. It was coated with the same poison as the first. Kaelin roared, a sound of agony and rage, but he did not fall. He fought on, a dying king determined to take his enemies with him. He cleared a path to her, striking Morkant across the face and sending him staggering back. He grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her behind him, shielding her with his body. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his breath coming in ragged pants. Blood was soaking his tunic. "I failed them. My family. I couldn't fail you." He looked at her then, and the fever, the fury, the pain, it all melted away, leaving only a devastating, soul-deep clarity. "I love you, Ilara," he whispered, the words torn from the very depths of his being. "I think I have from the moment you stood for that pup." Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed at her feet. The remaining guards hesitated, shocked by the king's confession. Morkant, however, saw his chance. He recovered, a cruel grin spreading across his face as he advanced on them, a long, wicked-looking blade in his hand. "Touching," he said. "Now you can die together." He raised the sword. Ilara looked down at Kaelin's still form. She saw the blood pooling on the stones. She heard his confession echoing in her heart. "I love you." He had fought for her. He had died for her. And she refused to accept it. Something hot and wild surged through her veins. It was not fear. It was not grief. It was rage. A pure, elemental fury that burned away every last trace of the meek, silent servant she had once been. She knelt, pressing her hands to the wound in his side, to the place where his life was pouring out. She did not know what she was doing. She only knew she would not let him go. "No," she whispered, the word of vow. Morkant brought the sword down. Ilara screamed. It was not a scream of terror. It was a scream of defiance, of creation, of power unleashed. The stone floor of the tower erupted. Thick, thorny vines, green and vibrant with life, burst from the cracks between the flagstones. They moved like serpents, wrapping around Morkant's legs, his arms, his throat, lifting him off the ground. The sword clattered from his nerveless fingers. His men cried out in terror as the very tower came alive around them, tendrils of ivy and stone-breaking roots ensnaring them, pinning them to the walls. A blinding emerald light poured from Ilara's hands, sinking into Kaelin's body. She felt the poison in him, a cold, dark, creeping thing. She felt her own power, a warm, green, living tide, rise up to meet it. It was a battle fought in his veins, in his very soul. The tower groaned, and the stones themselves seemed to shift, sealing the doorway, encasing them in a living tomb of their own. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a queen was being born in fire and grief. The fight for Kaelin's life was long. The poison was cunning, clinging to the shadows of his guilt, feeding on his old pain. Alara poured everything she was into him, her own life force a shield against the darkness. She felt his memories, the smoke and the screams of the fire night, the crushing weight of his failure. She met his despair with her love, her unwavering belief in him. Slowly, painstakingly, the green light began to win. The poison receded, burned away by the sheer, unyielding force of life. When the last of it was gone, she collapsed over him, utterly spent. The vines retreated back into the stone, releasing their prisoners, who fled the haunted tower in terror. The light faded, leaving only the gray light of the storm. For a long time there was only the sound of the wind and her own ragged breathing. Then a hand touched her hair. She looked up. Kaelin's eyes were open. They were clear. The fever was gone. The pain was gone. The deep, soul-crushing sorrow that had lived in them for 50 years was gone. He looked at her, and his face was filled with a wonder so profound it stole her breath. "Alara," he breathed, his voice hoarse. He reached up, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "You saved me. You saved me first," she whispered, tears finally falling. He pulled her down, his arms wrapping around her, holding her with a strength that was gentle and absolute. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the shudder that went through his entire body. It was the shudder of a man who had been drowning for half a century and had just taken his first breath. They were not a king and a servant. They were not an alpha and an orphan. They were just two broken souls who had found their other half in the heart of a storm. They were mated, not by law or ceremony, but by sacrifice, and a love that had defied death itself. 6 months later, the stone citadel was no longer gray. Greenery trailed from every balcony. The silver rose that had once been Alara's secret now grew in abundance in the royal gardens, its scent of cinnamon and snow a constant, gentle perfume on the sea breeze. The castle felt alive, breathing with a warmth it hadn't known in a century. Alara stood on the balcony of their chambers, the morning sun warm on her face. She was no longer the Lady Alara, a title that had never fit. She was the Luna Queen, a title that felt as natural as breathing. The pack adored her. They had felt her power, the life that flowed from her. And they knew she was the true heart of their kingdom. Lord Morcant and the other traitors were imprisoned, their plot exposed by the very guards they had tried to command. Seraphina, hearing of the failed coup and the miracle in the tower, had fled into exile, a disgraced queen with no power and no allies. The obvious threat was gone. The real one, Kaelin's guilt, had been healed not by power, but by love. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of Kaelin's chest. He no longer wore the mask of a grieving king. His face was relaxed, the harsh lines softened. He smiled now, a slow, rare thing that was more beautiful than any sunrise. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "How quiet it is," she said. He chuckled, the sound a low rumble against her back. "I find I prefer it. The silence with you is better than the noise with anyone else." A silver-furred wolf, now nearly full-grown, trotted onto the balcony and nudged her hand with his wet nose. Cinder. He was a constant, happy shadow at their heels. Kaelin's hand rested on her still flat stomach, a gesture of gentle possession and boundless hope. A new life was beginning, a new reason to grow. He turned her in his arms, his winter sea eyes warm and full of a love that still, after all this time, made her feel breathless. He had been a man frozen in his past, a king entombed in sorrow. She had been a girl with nothing but a secret seed of life inside her. Together, they had thawed a kingdom. "I love you, my queen," he said, the words no longer costing him anything but given freely, joyfully. "And I love you, my king," she replied, her heart full. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of sea salt and cinnamon and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. The beast inside him was no longer a restless, grieving creature. It was calm, content, and purring with a love that had healed them all. The king who had once said nothing now had a lifetime of words to share, and a queen who would always be there to hear them.